Hi, this is Diana from Yarnetti's Crochet, and we're here to talk about what happens when our work gets wider and wider and wider. And if your project keeps getting wider, every row, you're not alone. This happens to almost every beginning crocheter. What's happening is that there's extra stitches that are being added somewhere in the row, and it's oftentimes is at the edges. And in this video, I'll show you the four most common reasons why crochet gets wider and some simple ways to prevent it. So you can see with my swatch here, I started out with, let me count my stitches. I have a turning chain here. Gracie, stop. My cat thinks that she should be a part of things. So here's the turning chain here. Here's 1 stitch, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 stitches. And by the time I get all the way up here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 stitches. So there's quite a few stitches that are being added. So one of the things that I did, and I can see that I did it, is I added an extra stitch in my turning chain. And I shouldn't have done that because in this particular pattern, my turning chain counts as a stitch. This turning chain counts as a stitch. So by adding an additional stitch into the first stitch, I'm increasing. So every time I added a double crochet next to and into this first stitch, it increased my stitch count by 1. So as I said before, in this particular pattern, the turning chain counts as a first stitch in the row. And what I did is I have my first stitch, that's the turning chain, and then I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to add a stitch right in here because it looks, there's a hole there. It looks like I should add a stitch there. And actually, I shouldn't have. This increased my stitch count. And I did this on, I think I did it on every row. I did it over here. You can see I have my turning chain, and then I have that stitch right in that double crochet right into the first stitch. So that was an increase there. I have an increase on the next row, and then then look at this. I added 2 stitches, 2 double crochets, and 1 stitch. So that increased my stitch count. The other thing that can make your crochet look like it's getting wider and wider, it's not only your the number of stitches that have increased. If you accidentally, let's say you're starting with a 6mm crochet hook, you start your project, and you put your project down, you go get a cup of coffee, and you come back, and then you pick up a 5.5mm hook, or you can't remember which hook, and it's a larger hook than when you started, your crochet is going to get larger and larger and larger just because you're using a larger hook size. So I have a little fun way to help you remember your hook size. Stick to the end because I'm going to show you what I like to do to remember what hook I'm using with a project. The other thing that can happen is, let's say you're crocheting along and you've crocheted several rows and you put your work away because you got to head to bed, and the next day while you're watching TV, you get your project out and you're really stressed out. You've had a stressful day and you start crocheting either more loosely or more tightly than you did the day before. This can happen especially with beginners. Beginners, we struggle sometimes with consistency and our attention. And you know what? It doesn't just happen to beginners. It happens to experienced crocheters as well, because I've had this happen. I'll be working on a sweater, I'll be working on a large project, and I'll note, or a blanket. This happens with blankets with me. And I'll notice usually what happens is it starts to get smaller. The size of my work will change. So let's talk about how we can prevent your crochet from getting larger and larger. The first thing is, you remember at the beginning I counted my stitches. One thing you can do with each row is to count your stitches. I know it's like, ugh, I don't want to have to count my stitches every single row. You might want to do that the first couple rows. Another way to help yourself is to mark your first and last stitch with stitch markers. So if your first stitch is a chain of 3 and you're working a double crochet, you need to mark, sorry about that, you need to mark the top of that turning chain. That's your first stitch right there. And then you need to mark the very last stitch in the row right here. So when you turn your work and you start crocheting, I'm going to make my chain 3. And and I know this is my first stitch. I don't crochet into that because my chain counts as my first stitch. So I don't crochet into that. I crochet into the second stitch. Now this works the same way if you're doing half double crochet or single crochet. Marking the first and last stitches of the row help you to keep your stitch count consistent. So we did talk about tension changes, and sometimes we can control that, sometimes we can't. One thing that you can do as you're crocheting, if your crochet seems to be larger as you're crocheting, there is something called the golden loop, and it's this loop right here. This loop has a big influence on how big your stitch is. So if your stitches are getting too tall, it's probably because you're yanking or you're stretching that golden loop. So pay attention to that as you're crocheting. You might need to adjust that golden loop. The other time as you're crocheting, that might be impacting how large your crochet stitches are is during the yarn over. Sometimes as we're yarning over, we take our hook and we stretch out that loop here before we yarn over to insert our hook. Now I'm going to show you what happens now. Look, this stitch looks, that loop looks kind of bigger. So when we come back and we do the next row, our stitches are going to be wider. So let me show you that again. So as we're yarning over, sometimes we accidentally yank up that yarn a little bit before we yarn over, and it makes our top loop quite large. Now one way to mitigate that a little bit, as you're yarning over, use your pointer finger to kind of to hold that yarn over in place before you insert your hook, because it keeps this loop from stretching out. Let me do it again. Right here. Insert my hook. I'm still holding it, yarn over, and I may even hold these loops in place so they are nicely sized before I yarn over and pull through 2. Might check it again. Make sure they're right, using my pointer finger to hold those loops in place, yarn over, and pull through again. So as I said, there's a lot of different reasons why our our work gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It usually has to do with somewhere along the line we've added stitches, and a lot of times it has to do with the turning chain and not knowing whether or not your turning chain counts as a stitch, especially in double crochet. If your turning chain counts as your first stitch, you're going to skip that first stitch, you're not going to add another stitch in there. And I have a little sheet that I have a free download, and what this is kind of a cheat sheet, and it tells you how many chains to make if you want to make a row of single crochet, and it especially talks about your turning chain and whether or not your turning chains count as a stitch. Whether you're doing single crochet, half double, double crochet, or even treble crochet. So it's free if you want it. I will link it in the pinned comment or in the show notes. So as I said before, somewhere along the line there's extra stitches that are sneaking in. Counting your stitches, using stitch markers, and I want to show you my little trick that I like to use if I am working on a project, or a large project or a small project, and I want to make sure I remember what hook size I'm using. I made these little, they're like giant stitch markers actually, and what I have on them are, I have the letter and the millimeter of the hook. So this particular project I am using a J hook, so I can just hook it. I can hook the lobster clasp onto the work and throw my work with my yarn into my project bag and not worry about remembering what my hook was. The other way is to keep a little notebook inside your project bag or inside your little pouch where you keep all your supplies, and write down what hook you're using for a particular project. So if you found this helpful, excellent, please like and subscribe. And also, if you are continuing to struggle with working your first row of stitches, you know, maybe your first row looks a little messy or you're struggling to crochet into that chain, be sure and watch the next video because I show you how you can fix your messy first row. Thanks for watching.